December 1944. The vast Pacific Ocean had become a closing net around the Empire of Japan, on the small, strategic island of Lubang in the Philippines. The air was heavy with the humidity of the jungle and the impending arrival of the American fleet. Standing amidst this tension was Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, a 22-year-old intelligence officer. Onoda was different from the average infantryman. He had been trained at the elite Nakano School, a secret military academy that specialized in unconventional warfare, while traditional Japanese soldiers were taught that surrender was the ultimate shame and that death was preferable to capture. Onoda had been taught a radically different philosophy. Survival was the only duty. He was trained to operate behind enemy lines, to disrupt, to gather information, and above all, to stay alive. It was in this atmosphere that his commanding officer, Major Taniguchi, gave him an order that would defy the passage of time. Taniguchi looked Onoda in the eye and delivered a directive that would become the young lieutenant's entire reason for existing for the next 3 decades. "You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand," the major stated firmly. "It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we will come back for you. Until then, so long as you have one soldier, you are to continue to lead him. You may have to live on coconuts. If that's the case, live on coconuts. Under no circumstances are you to give up your life voluntarily." Onoda accepted this command as a sacred vow. However, the situation on Lubang deteriorated faster than anticipated. When the American forces landed on February 28, 1945, the island's defenses collapsed under the sheer weight of the assault. The command structure fractured, and Onoda was unable to complete his mission to destroy the airfield and pier. As the main Japanese force surrendered or was neutralized, Onoda gathered 3 other soldiers, Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Suchi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshi. Together, they slipped away from the coast and vanished into the dense, mountainous interior of the island, carrying their rifles, a limited supply of ammunition, and the conviction that this was merely a temporary retreat. For months, they lived as ghosts in the rainforest, conducting small surveillance missions and waiting for the Japanese counterattack. Then, in August 1945, the unimaginable happened. The atomic bombs fell, the Emperor spoke over the radio, and the war officially ended. Silence fell over the Pacific, but deep in the canopy of Lubang, the news was not received with relief. It was received with deep suspicion. When the first leaflets were dropped over the jungle in October, announcing the surrender and ordering all stragglers to come down from the mountains, Onoda was the one who examined them. To a normal soldier, the leaflet was a ticket home, but to an intelligence officer trained to spot deception and psychological warfare, it looked like a trap. Onoda analyzed the wording and the quality of the print. He concluded that the language was slightly off, likely written by a Nisei, Japanese-American trying to trick them into captivity. He reasoned that Japan would never surrender unconditionally. It was impossible. Therefore, the war must still be continuing. He showed the paper to his men and explained his logic. This was an enemy fabrication designed to lure them out of their fortified positions. With a steely resolve, Onoda crumpled the paper and tossed it into the undergrowth. The world had moved on to peace, but for Hiroo Onoda, the war had just entered its second phase. As the calendar pages turned from weeks into months, and then into years, the lush jungle of Lubang Island transformed from a temporary hiding spot into a vast, green prison. For Onoda and his 3 companions, the concept of time began to blur. The initial adrenaline of combat was replaced by the grueling monotony of survival against the elements. The rainforest was a relentless adversary, subjecting them to torrential rains, suffocating humidity, and a constant barrage of insects. Their uniforms, once the proud symbol of the Imperial Army, slowly rotted off their bodies, forcing them to patch the disintegrating fabric with whatever materials they could scavenge. Yet, despite the harsh conditions, Onoda maintained strict military discipline. They were not castaways. They were soldiers on an extended mission, keeping their rifles cleaned and their minds sharp waiting for the counterattack they were certain was coming. The outside world tried repeatedly to pierce their wall of isolation. Throughout the late 1940s, search parties would occasionally venture into the interior, leaving behind newspapers, letters from families, and photographs. To any rational observer, these items were irrefutable proof that the war had ended and Japan had surrendered. But Onoda viewed every piece of evidence through the distorted lens of his intelligence training. When he saw a newspaper, he didn't see news. He saw a sophisticated fabrication created by the enemy. He analyzed the quality of the paper and the smell of the ink, convincing himself and his men that the Americans were going to extraordinary lengths to trick them into captivity. Every attempt to save them only served to deepen their paranoia and resolve. To survive, the four men became ghosts of the mountain. They developed a nomadic lifestyle, never sleeping in the same place for more than a few nights to avoid detection by the local police or villagers. They learned the rhythms of the island perfectly, knowing exactly when the wild bananas would ripen or when the cattle would graze in certain clearings. They built makeshift huts out of bamboo and palm leaves during the rainy season, constructing them in such a way that they blended seamlessly into the foliage, invisible from the air. They were living in a suspended reality, completely cut off from the 20th century, fighting a war that existed only in their own minds. The delusion was reinforced by events happening in the wider world. When the Korean War broke out in the early 1950s, American jets began flying over the Philippines. Onoda looked up at the sky, saw the new aircraft, and took it as confirmation that the great battle for East Asia was still raging. He interpreted the lights of distant ships as the Japanese Navy preparing for a landing. To him, the increased air traffic wasn't a separate conflict. It was proof that the Japanese Empire was striking back, and his mission to hold the island was more critical than ever. However, the psychological strain of this existence began to fracture the group's unity. In 1949, Private Yuichi Akatsu, the youngest and least experienced of the four, began to struggle with the harshness of their life. The isolation weighed heavily on him, and he became distant, often lagging behind during their movements through the dense brush. One day, he simply vanished. Onoda and the other two men waited for him, fearful that he had been captured and would reveal their location, but he did not return. Akatsu had successfully slipped away, eventually surrendering to the Philippine authorities and telling the world that the others were still alive. Back in the jungle, Onoda interpreted Akatsu's disappearance not as a realization of the truth, but as a betrayal. He told his remaining two men, Shimada and Kozuka, that Akatsu had likely been captured and coerced by the enemy. Instead of realizing the war was over, Onoda doubled down on his resolve. He believed they were now in even greater danger. He tightened security, moved the group further into the treacherous interior, and prepared for a long siege. The group was smaller now, reduced to 3, but their shared delusion was stronger than ever. The surrender of Private Akatsu in 1950 changed the dynamic of the jungle completely. The outside world now had confirmation that Japanese stragglers were indeed alive on Lubang, and the efforts to retrieve them intensified. The Philippine government and Japanese officials collaborated to send search parties equipped with loudspeakers, blasting recorded messages into the dense canopy. They dropped letters and photos from the men's families, pleading with them to come home. To the rescuers, this was a humanitarian mission of mercy. To Onoda, however, the sudden increase in activity was interpreted as a tactical offensive. He believed the enemy was getting desperate, using psychological warfare to lure his unit into an ambush. Every voice booming from a loudspeaker was analyzed as a deception. Every letter found on a trail was scrutinized for hidden codes that simply weren't there. The psychological walls Onoda had built were so thick that even the voice of his own brother could unbreak through. When a search party played a recording of Onoda's brother begging him to surrender, Onoda listened intently from the safety of the brush. He recognized the tone and the inflection, but his training at the Nakano School overrode his emotions. He reasoned that the Americans must have captured his brother and forced him to speak, or perhaps they had used technology to synthesize the voice. Instead of walking toward the sound of family, Onoda retreated further into the mountains, convinced that the enemy was using his personal history as a weapon against him. The standoff turned tragic in May 1954. The group, now reduced to 3, was camped near the beach at Gontan. A shootout erupted when a search party, which Onoda believed to be enemy combatants, spotted them. In the ensuing chaos of the escape, Corporal Shuichi Shimada was struck by a bullet. He did not survive the encounter. The loss was devastating for the unit. Shimada had been a rock of stability, a loyal soldier who had endured nearly a decade of privation alongside them. Now, his war was over. Onoda and the last remaining soldier, Private First Class Kinshiki, buried their comrade in the jungle and offered a silent salute. They were now a unit of two. The death of Shimada forged an unbreakable bond between Onoda and Kosuka. For the next 18 years, the two men would exist as a single organism, anticipating each other's thoughts and movements without speaking a word. They fell into a rigid, almost monastic routine to maintain their sanity and health. They woke with the sun, cleaned their rifles with obsessive care, and patrolled their territory. They patched their disintegrating uniforms with hemp fiber and needles made from wire, maintaining a semblance of military order in the wild. They were the last two guardians of an empire that no longer existed, fueling each other's conviction that they were holding a strategic point for a counteroffensive that was always just over the horizon. During these long years, they continued their mission with a warped sense of duty. They believed that the local farmers were actually disguised enemy troops, and that the crops being grown were supplies for the American army. To disrupt this perceived logistical chain, Onoda and Kosuka would conduct guerrilla raids, burning piles of harvested rice and firing warning shots to disperse what they thought were enemy laborers. Two delocals. They were terrifying phantoms of the forest. To Onoda, these were necessary acts of sabotage to support the Imperial Japanese Navy, which he believed was still fighting in the Pacific. By the end of the 1950s, the world began to move on. Search parties returned empty-handed year after year. The dense jungle of Lubang refused to give up its secrets. In December 1959, after years of silence and no confirmed sightings, the Japanese government officially declared Hiroo Onoda and Kinshiki Kosuka dead. Their families held funerals, burying empty caskets and placing memorial tablets on household altars. The file was closed. The world assumed the jungle had finally claimed them. But deep in the interior, oblivious to their own funerals, Onoda and Kosuka were still very much alive, checking their ammunition and scanning the horizon, waiting for an order that was 30 years late. The decade of the 1960s passed like a rumor over the canopy of Lubang Island. While the rest of humanity watched man land on the moon, the Beatles take over the radio, and the Cold War escalate. Hiroo Onoda and Kinshiki Kosuka remained frozen in 1945. They were living artifacts, surviving on a diet of stolen bananas, wild boars, and grim determination. For 27 years, they had been each other's mirror, validating their shared delusion that the war was still ongoing. They were no longer just comrades. They were two halves of the same consciousness. As long as they were together, the impossible reality they had constructed made sense. They patched their uniforms, oiled their rifles, and spoke of the glorious day when the Imperial Army would finally return to relieve them. By 1972, however, time had begun to take its physical toll. Onoda was now 50 years old. Kosuka was 50. They were no longer the agile young men who had vanished into the hills at the end of the war. Their bodies were weathered by decades of malnutrition and exposure to the tropical elements. Yet, their routine of sabotage continued unabated. They believed it was their duty to disrupt the enemy's supply lines, which meant burning piles of rice that had been harvested by local farmers. On October 19, 1972, this sense of duty led them out of the safety of the deep jungle and into a clearing near the village of Salak, a decision that would shatter Onoda's world forever. The two men approached a stack of rice drying in the sun, intending to set it ablaze, as they had done countless times before. But this time, the situation was different. A local police patrol was in the area, responding to the villagers' complaints about the mountain ghosts destroying their crops. As Onoda and Kosuka began their operation, the silence of the afternoon was ripped apart by the crack of gunfire. It was not the American invasion force they had feared for decades, but a small group of Philippine police officers protecting the village. In the confusion of the skirmish, luck finally ran out for the holdouts. Onoda, sensing the danger, signaled for a retreat to the tree line. He moved quickly, assuming his partner was right behind him. But when he looked back, he saw Kazuka fall. There was no dramatic final speech, no heroic last stand, just the sudden, jarring end of a life that had been suspended in time. Onoda rushed to his friend's side, but it was too late. Kinzichi Kosuka, the man who had been his shadow, and his only link to sanity for nearly 30 years, was gone. Panic and grief struggled for dominance in Onoda's mind, but his training took over. He grabbed Kazuka's rifle. He would not leave a weapon for the enemy and sprinted into the dense undergrowth. As the police approached the fallen soldier, Onoda vanished into the twilight, alone. The silence that settled over the jungle that night was heavier than anything he had ever experienced. For the first time since 1945, he was truly the last man standing. The psychological buffer that Kazuka had provided was stripped away, leaving Onoda to face the crushing weight of his mission in total solitude. The death of Kazuka sent shockwaves all the way to Tokyo. When the body was identified, the Japanese public was stunned. They had held funerals for these men. In 1959, they were supposed to be dead. The realization that 2 soldiers had been fighting World War II in the jungle for 27 years and that one was still out there gripped the nation. Search parties were immediately organized, bigger and more desperate than before. They knew Onoda was alone, armed, and dangerous. But they also knew he was a tragic figure, a man trapped in a time loop of loyalty. The hunt for the last samurai had officially begun, following the death of his partner. Hiroo Onoda vanished completely. For nearly 2 years, he lived in a state of hypervigilance that bordered on the supernatural. He was now the sole survivor of the Lubang garrison. Convinced that the enemy was tightening the noose around him, he slept with his rifle clutched to his chest, his finger always near the trigger, waking at the slightest rustle of a leaf. The Japanese government spent millions of yen sending massive search parties to the island, comprised of family members and former comrades. But they failed miserably. They marched through the jungle with loudspeakers and heavy boots, making so much noise that Onoda simply melted away into the shadows long before they arrived. It seemed that the harder they tried to find him, the deeper he buried himself in the myth of the war. Then, in February 1974, a variable entered the equation that Onoda's military training could never have predicted. A college dropout and eccentric adventurer named Norio Suzuki arrived on Lubang Island. Suzuki was not a soldier. He was a wanderer, with a shaggy haircut and a disarming smile. He had told his friends back in Japan that he was going on a quest to find 3 things. In specific order: Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman. While the professional search teams had used military tactics, Suzuki used intuition. He reasoned that Onoda was lonely and would be attracted not by force, but by a reminder of home. Suzuki trekked into the jungle alone, setting up a simple camp in a clearing. He didn't hide. He made himself obvious. During the day, he hung his laundry and cooked food. At night, instead of scanning the perimeter with a weapon, he sat by his fire and sang old Japanese folk songs. He was betting his life on the theory that Onoda was not a monster, but a homesick man. 4 days into his expedition, his theory was proven right. As Suzuki sat by his tent, the foliage parted, and a gaunt figure appeared, leveling a rusted Arisaka rifle at the young man's chest. It was the Phantom of Lubang. The tension in that moment was palpable. Onoda could have pulled the trigger instantly, ending the threat as he had been trained to do. But something about Suzuki gave him pause. The boy didn't flinch. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, Suzuki looked at the terrifying figure of the lost soldier and simply said, "Onoda-san, the Emperor, and the people of Japan are worried about you." For the first time in 30 years, the wall of hostility was breached. Onoda lowered his rifle, and the 2 men sat down by the fire. They talked through the night. Suzuki told him everything. The war had ended in 1945. Japan was an economic superpower. The Olympics had been held in Tokyo, and the world he knew was gone. Onoda listened intently, smoking cigarettes offered by the young man. He admitted that he had suspected the war might be over, but his programming was too deep to override. He explained his dilemma with heartbreaking clarity. "I am a soldier," he said. "I cannot leave my post without orders from my commanding officer. He wasn't staying out of stubbornness. He was staying out of loyalty. He had been ordered to hold the island until relieved, and nobody had ever relieved him. Suzuki realized then that no amount of proof would bring Onoda home. He didn't need a newspaper. He needed a chain of command. The young adventurer made a pact with the old soldier. He promised Onoda that he would return to Japan, find the man who had given the order in 1944, Major Taniguchi, and bring him back to Lubang to officially relieve him of duty. Onoda agreed to the terms. He would wait at a designated spot for their return. As dawn broke, they parted ways. The hippie adventurer heading back to civilization to find a commander, and the last samurai fading back into the jungle to wait for one final order. Norio Suzuki kept his word. Upon returning to Japan, the young adventurer launched a nationwide search for Major Yoshimi, the man who had given Onoda his standing orders 30 years prior. It was a surreal mission. The Imperial Army had ceased to exist decades ago, and its officers had faded into civilian anonymity. Suzuki finally tracked Taniguchi down in a quiet bookstore, where the former major was now working as a humble bookseller. When told that his subordinate was still holding the line in the Philippines, waiting for a relief order that never came, Taniguchi was stunned into silence. He dusted off his old uniform, which no longer fit quite right, and flew to Lubang Island to fulfill a promise he had made in another lifetime. On March 9, 1974, the rendezvous took place in the humid clearing agreed upon by Suzuki and Onoda. The atmosphere was thick with the weight of history. Hiroo Onoda emerged from the jungle, wearing his tattered, patched uniform, his rifle shouldered with impeccable discipline. He stood stiffly at attention, facing the man he had not seen since he was 22 years old. Major Taniguchi, holding a document from the defunct Imperial General Headquarters, read the final order aloud. The Special Squadron is relieved of all military duties. You are to cease all combat operations immediately. Onoda listened to the words, his face a mask of stoicism. But inside, his reality was crumbling. The war was not paused. It was over. We had lost. The surrender ceremony that followed was a moment of global fascination. Onoda officially handed over his Arisaka Type 99 rifle to Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos. The weapon was still in perfect working condition, polished and oiled, with 500 rounds of ammunition and several hand grenades. It was a testament to his fanatical dedication. In a gesture of profound reconciliation, President Marcos accepted the weapon and immediately pardoned Onoda for his activities on the island, acknowledging that the soldier had lived under the belief that a state of war still existed. The man who had been a phantom of the jungle was now a free civilian. Returning to Japan, Onoda was greeted as a hero. A crowd of thousands waved flags at the airport, and the media hailed him as the embodiment of traditional Japanese values: loyalty, sacrifice, and endurance that many felt had been lost in the post-war economic boom. However, for Onoda, the homecoming was disorienting. He had left an empire of wood and paper and returned to a nation of concrete, neon lights, and television. He struggled to understand a society that seemed soft and materialistic compared to the brutal purity of the jungle. He was a man out of time, celebrated by a country he no longer recognized, seeking a new frontier where he could live by his own rules. Onoda eventually emigrated to Brazil. He bought a cattle ranch in the state of Mato Grosso do Sul, channeling his survival energy into taming the land. He found peace in the vastness of the South American plains, far away from the cameras and the noise of Tokyo. Yet, he never fully abandoned his sense of duty. In the 1980s, after reading about Japanese teenagers committing violence, he returned to Japan to establish the Onoda Nature School. He wanted to teach the younger generation the survival skills and mental toughness he had mastered, hoping to instill in them the character that had kept him alive for 3 decades. Hiroo Onoda passed away in 2014 at the age of 91. His life remains one of the most complex psychological studies of the 20th century. Was it a tragedy of wasted years, or a triumph of the human will? He spent the prime of his life fighting a war that didn't exist, driven by an order that couldn't be broken. But in doing so, he proved the terrifying and awe-inspiring power of belief. He showed the world that a human being can endure almost anything if they have a purpose, even if that purpose is an illusion. He was the last soldier of a fallen empire, the man who proved that the war isn't over until the soldier decides to put down his gun. Though the surrender in 1974 marked the official end of his war, the internal battle within Hiroo Onoda continued long after he handed over his rifle. The transition from the jungle to civilization was not just a culture shock, it was a collision of two different realities. In modern Japan, Onoda was treated as a celebrity, a living museum piece of a bygone era. Yet, he found himself deeply disillusioned with the country he had returned to. He saw a society that had become, in his eyes, soft, overly reliant on technology, and disconnected from the traditional values of resilience and so. This disillusionment was the primary driver for his move to Brazil. There, amidst the vast, untamed cattle lands of Mato Grosso, he found a landscape that made sense to him, a place where nature still dictated the rules, and where survival required hard work, not just a push of a button. However, the shadow of Lubang Island was never far behind him. While the world celebrated his loyalty, there was a darker, often unspoken chapter of his legacy that weighed heavily on his conscience. During his 30-year guerrilla campaign, more than 30 Filipino islanders had lost their lives in skirmishes with Onoda's unit, and countless others were wounded. For the families of those villagers, Onoda was not a hero of loyalty, but a terrifying force that had haunted their mountains for a generation. It is a testament to the complexity of war that the same actions can be viewed as supreme, patriotism by one side and tragic violence by the other. Onoda had to live with the knowledge that his mission had real-world collateral damage long after peace had been declared. In a profound act of reconciliation, Onoda returned to Lubang Island in 1996, 22 years after his surrender. It was not a trip for nostalgia, but a pilgrimage of atonement. He revisited the caves where he had slept and the clearings where he had fought. But, most importantly, he came bearing a gift. This desire to build rather than destroy became the central theme of his final years. Upon establishing the Onoda Nature School in Japan, his curriculum was unique. He didn't teach the children how to fight. He taught them how to live. He took soft, urban teenagers into the wilderness and taught them how to start fires, how to build shelters, and how to endure discomfort without complaining. His philosophy was simple. Modern life had removed the necessity of struggle, and without struggle, the human spirit withers. He wanted to give the next generation the gift of adversity, believing that once a person realizes they can survive the cold and the dark, they become unbreakable in their daily lives. The fascinating duality of Onoda lies in his mental fortitude. Psychologists have studied his case for decades, trying to understand how a human mind can maintain a delusion for so long without fracturing. The consensus is that Onoda was not insane. He was actually hypersane. He said logic-critical thinking and evidence analysis, albeit flawed, evidence to construct a rational world where the war was still happening. He didn't stay in the jungle because he was lost. He stayed because he had too much integrity to accept a reality that contradicted his orders. He is a reminder of the terrifying power of the human mind to shape its own reality. Ultimately, the story of the last samurai forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the nature of duty. Where is the line between admirable loyalty and tragic obstinacy? At what point does a soldier become a prisoner of his own code? Hiroo Onoda stands at that blurry intersection. He remains one of history's most compelling figures, not because of the battles he won, but because of the sheer impossibility of his existence. He proved that a man can live in a different time, a different war, and a different reality, simply by refusing to believe that the world has changed without him. Even as an old man living in the comfort of modern civilization, Hiroo Onoda never truly left Lubang Island. Those who knew him in his later years, both in Brazil and Japan, reported that the habits of the guerrilla soldier were permanently etched into his DNA. He would often sleep with a knife under his pillow, not out of fear, but out of a decades-old muscle memory that dictated one must always be ready to defend their life. When entering a restaurant or a public building, he would instinctively scan the room for exits and sit with his back to the wall, his eyes constantly moving, assessing threats that no longer existed. The jungle had conditioned him to be a creature of perpetual alertness, and no amount of peace treaties or comfortable beds could undo 30 years of survival programming. This internal persistence of the warrior spirit made him a complex figure in a Japan that was rapidly modernizing, while the younger generation was obsessed with technology, anime, and global commerce. Onoda remained a stoic reminder of a harder, colder past. He often criticized what he saw as the spiritual weakening of his countrymen. He believed that the ease of modern life had stripped people of their ability to endure hardship, which is why he dedicated his final energy to the nature school. He wasn't just teaching kids how to camp. He was trying to transplant a piece of his own iron will into a generation he feared was becoming too soft. He wanted to ensure that the concept of Yamato Damashita, intrepid Japanese spirit, did not die with him. The end of his extraordinary journey came not with a bang, but with a quiet fade. In January 2014, at the age of 91, the man who had survived malaria, tropical storms, and 30 years of military encirclement finally succumbed to heart failure and pneumonia in a Tokyo hospital. It was a stark contrast to the death he had prepared for all his life. He had expected to die in the mud, clutching his rifle, fighting to the last breath for his emperor. Instead, he passed away in sterile white sheets, surrounded by the hum of medical machinery, in a peaceful country that had long since moved on from the war that defined him. The news of his death triggered a final wave of global reflection. Writers, historians, and filmmakers from around the world paused to consider the magnitude of his life. The famous German director Werner Herzog, who had met Onoda and was mesmerized by his story, wrote a book about him, titled The Twilight World, describing Onoda, not just as a soldier but as a mythical figure who had lived a dream of war. To the international community, Onoda had transcended politics. He was no longer viewed merely as a combatant of the Axis powers. He was seen as a testament to the terrifying and beautiful capacity of the human will to adhere to a narrative, even when that narrative contradicts the entire world. Legacy is a complicated thing for a man like Hiroo Onoda. Critics rightfully point to the futility of his mission and the pain inflicted on the villagers of Lubang. Supporters point to his flawless discipline and loyalty. But perhaps the true value of his story lies in the mirror it holds up to the rest of us. In an age of fleeting attention spans and shifting values, Onoda represents the absolute extreme of commitment. He poses a challenging question to every person who hears his story. Is there anything in your life, any belief, or any cause that you would be willing to give 30 years of your life to defend, alone in the dark? As history closes the file on the Second World War, the figure of Hiroo Onoda stands apart from the generals and the politicians. He remains the eternal sentry of the jungle. His uniform is now in a museum, and his rifle is silent behind glass, but the echo of his life continues to resonate. He was the last samurai, the man who proved that a war is only over when the mind accepts defeat. In the end, Hiroo Onoda didn't just survive the jungle. He became it, unyielding, dangerous, and enduring long after the rest of the world had surrendered to time. After the ticker-tape parades ended and the camera crews moved on to the next story, Hiroo Onoda found himself fighting a battle for which he had no training. The battle against modern emptiness. He had returned to a Japan that was economically booming, filled with neon lights, vending machines, and salarymen rushing to high-rise offices. Yet, to the man who had lived for 30 years with nothing but his convictions, this new society appeared hollow. He famously remarked that while Japan had rebuilt its cities, it had lost its soul. He saw a generation of economic animals, people who were comfortable but lacked the spirit of Yamato Damashita, intrinsic resilience that had defined his ancestors. He felt like a stranger in his own home, a zoo animal put on display for a public that regarded him as a curiosity rather than a soldier. Unable to reconcile his jungle values with concrete corporate culture, Onoda did what he always did. He sought a new frontier. In 1975, he emigrated to Brazil, purchasing a plot of land in the remote, rugged terrain of Mato Grosso do Sul. This was not a retirement. It was a new campaign. He approached cattle ranching with the same fanatical discipline he had applied to guerrilla warfare. He cleared the land, built fences, and battled the elements, finding peace in the brutal honesty of nature. In Brazil, the rules were simple. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. There was no ambiguity, no politics, just the raw struggle for survival that made him feel alive. However, the war called him back in the 1980s. News reached him in Brazil about a shocking trend in his homeland, a rise in violent crimes committed by Japanese teenagers, including a notorious case where a boy killed his parents with a metal baseball bat. Onoda was horrified. He concluded that the youth of Japan were becoming mentally fragile because they had never experienced true adversity. They had everything given to them, and as a result, they had no value for life. He decided that his final mission would not be military, but educational. He returned to Japan to establish the Onoda Shizen Jukutho Onoda Nakano School. The philosophy of the school was radical in its simplicity. Onoda didn't run a boot camp. He didn't scream or force children to march in formation. Instead, he simply introduced them to the unforgiving reality of the wild. He took soft, urban children who had never slept without air conditioning and placed them in the forest. They had to gather their own firewood, cook their own rice, and build their own shelters. When a child complained that the smoke was stinging their eyes or the ground was too hard, Onoda would simply watch them with his intense, dark eyes and say, "Nature does not compromise. You must adapt." He taught them that survival was not about fighting nature, but about listening to it. He showed them how to read the wind, how to conserve energy, and most importantly, how to be useful to the group. In the jungle, a selfish soldier endangers the unit. In the nature school, a selfish child leaves the group hungry. The transformation in these students was often profound. Under the guidance of the Phantom of Lubang, spoiled teenagers learned the quiet dignity of self. Onoda realized that he was saving these children in a way he had never been able to save his comrades. This period of his life softened the sharp edges of his public image. The terrifying soldier with a rifle became the stern but wise grandfather figure. He wasn't teaching them to die for the emperor. He was teaching them how to live for themselves. He often told his students that hope was not a vague emotion, but a tactical necessity. In the Gungo, if you lost hope, you died. He wanted to implant that survivalist kernel of hope into a generation that seemed to be drifting aimlessly. As he watched the children succeed in lighting a fire or navigating a trail, Onoda found a sense of closure that the surrender ceremony had failed to provide. He was no longer just a survivor of the past. He was a builder of the future. The final page of Hiroo Onoda's extraordinary life was turned on January 16, 2014. In a Tokyo hospital, far removed from the humid canopy of Lubang, the 91-year-old veteran surrendered to heart failure. It was a quiet, antiseptic end for a man who had spent his prime preparing for a violent death in the mud. He had lived long enough to see the world transform completely from the ashes of 1945 to the digital age of the 21st century. Yet, as he lay dying, those close to him noted that his spirit remained unyielding. He did not fear death. He had been living on borrowed time since he was 22. He viewed his extra decades not as a gift, but as a completed mission. The man who had refused to die without an order finally received the ultimate permission to rest. His passing triggered a global wave of reflection that went far beyond the borders of Japan. Major newspapers in New York, London, and Paris ran obituaries that were less about military history and more about the limits of human endurance. Filmmakers and writers, including the legendary Werner Herzog, eulogized him as a figure from a twilight world, a man who had lived a dream so intensely that it became reality. Onoda had ceased to be merely a soldier of the Axis powers. He had become a universal symbol of commitment. In an era defined by fleeting attention spans and shifting loyalties, he stood as a monolith of absolute, terrifying consistency. However, his legacy remains one of the most complex in modern history. To some, he was a tragic figure, a victim of indoctrination who wasted the best years of his life fighting a phantom war. To the families of the Filipino villagers killed during his 30-year guerrilla campaign, he was a stubborn invader who brought unnecessary pain long after peace had been declared. But to others, he was the last embodiment of the samurai spirit, a man who valued his word higher than his life. Onoda himself never apologized for his service. He simply explained it. "Oft inside I became an officer, and I received an order. If I could not carry it out, I would feel shame. For him, the morality was not in the politics of the war, but in the fidelity to the command. The true power of Onoda's story lies in what it reveals about the human mind. He proved that a human being can endure almost any physical hardship, hunger, disease, isolation, as long as they possess a why. His why was his order. He constructed a rational, logical world where his resistance made sense, ignoring 30 years of evidence to the contrary. He challenges us to consider the narratives we build in our own lives. He forces us to ask, what are the orders we are following? Are we living by our own values, or are we fighting wars that ended long ago? In the end, Hiroo Onoda forces a redefinition of the word survivor. He didn't just survive the jungle. A master d'Italiano, he didn't just survive the war. He outlasted it. He represents the extreme capability of the human will to deny defeat. While the rest of the world moved on to rebuilding and commerce, Onoda held the line. He showed that a single individual, armed only with conviction, can force the world to stop and pay attention. He was a living time capsule, a reminder that history is not just something written in books, but something lived and suffered by individuals. Today, his uniform hangs in a museum, clean to the jungle rot, and his Arisaka rifle sits silent behind glass. But the echo of his life resonates louder than ever. Hiroo Onoda was the last samurai, the final straggler of a fallen empire. His story stands as a monument to the terrifying and beautiful power of belief. He proved that the war is never truly over until the soldier decides to put down his gun. As we close the file on his 30-year patrol, we are left with the image of a lone figure standing in the twilight of the rainforest, waiting for an order that would take a lifetime to arrive, refusing to abandon his post until the very end.